Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's newspaper, look at the important articles relevant for your examination, and extract the type of questions which can be asked from these particular areas, and also learn the nuances of answer writing in general. Now, today, in total, we are going to have a discussion for 8 different topics in varying different proportions and depths depending upon their relevance for the examination. So, starting with the editorial section. So, in the editorial section, there are a couple of articles associated with the international relations perspective. So, the first article that we are going to consider is the importance of India Europe walking in step. Now, this is about the rebalancing of ties between India and Europe, relevant for your GS2. Then, Too Close for Comfort is another article associated with the Canadian US ties, which again reinforces into the first article's argument, and we will build up on that and take a look at that as well in a cohesive manner. Women's STEM careers and a more receptive industry. Now, this is about the labor force participation, female labor force participation in the economy, why it needs to be better, and what are the various different institutional roadblocks that women face when they go out to seek employment, and why is it that economy will benefit significantly if you have a greater female labor force participation, relevant for your GS paper 3. Direct questions have been asked even in the portion around essay. Now, the two state reality we see today revolves around the discussion, the ongoing discussion between the dispute between Israel and Palestine. And the article argues that how the world is basically turning a blind eye to the genocidal actions taken by Israel, and the proof of it lies in Israel's occupation in the region. So, this is again relevant for your GS paper 2. Some of the articles we are going to discuss briefly for its relevance in the prelims. Now, inflation continues to cool as food prices and crude rates dip. Now, inflation, both CPI and WPI, both of them have indicated a contraction. Now, or rather, a decline in the aspect of their growth. Now, what do they indicate? Now, decline in CPI is a good indicator, but decline in WPI can indicate a kind of a bad omen for the economy. Kaziranga records high diversity of grassland birds. Now, for a one of a kind census was carried out for the aviary species to be found in the grasslands of Kaziranga. Now, many of the species have staged a remarkable comeback in the region. We are going to take a look into two of these species, that is, the Bengal florican as well as the case of Finn's weaver. Now, scientists find pheromone that causes locusts to swarm and a way to block it. Now, this is about the locust swarm. And what is the concept of gregariousness? And with the help of this, we shall also be taking a look into the locust swarm which impacted India around 2019 2020, and how that can endanger food security of a nation. Machilipatnam port, after a long delay of decades now, is set for a revival, and that will mark the revival of an ancient port in our country's coastline. So, these are the various different articles that we are going to hold up for discussion. Starting with the first article of the day, that is the importance of India and Europe walking in step. Now, this is an article written by Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Now, this article talks about the relevance of India rebalancing its ties, Europe rebalancing its ties, and the argument for increased cooperation between India and Europe in the change or in the face of the changing geopolitical scenario. Now, this is an important aspect associated with your international relations. Now, before we break down this article, we have to understand why is it that we are discussing about the rebalancing of ties all of a sudden? Why is it that Europe becomes a center point of discussion after a long period of time? Post Second World War, the world had basically seen a withdrawal of Europe from the global geopolitical matters. Europe, on one hand, was always assured of American protection or American defense assuredness. And as a consequence, Europe could completely devote its budgetary allocations for development and welfareism. That led to the progress of many of the European nations not worrying about the defense parameters. But then, ever since the second administration or the second Trump administration has come to power in the US has become absolutely transactional in nature, cozying up of US with traditional adversaries of Europe like Russia. That has raised eyebrows in the region of Europe. Various different countries are recalibrating their approach. And for example, Germany has brought about certain constitutional changes in order to lead to further armament of the German state. And when you have the situation where even UK is preparing for a stage of active warfare, you have France talking about a nuclear umbrella. You have the reimagination of Weimar Triangle once again. So Europe is in a state of flux. And in that state of flux, Europe seeks cooperation and partnership with rising powers and middle powers. When we say middle powers mean those who have not that much or those who have not gained that much amount of political or diplomatic heft that they can influence decision and policies in various different nations, but nonetheless, they aspire to be future powers. India, being one of those middle powers, is very important keystone for Europe's international diplomatic outreach. So first of all, what triggered this rebalancing act of Europe, and why is it that Europe all of a sudden has started feeling insecure? So first of all, it is driven by the actions of you, as simple and as plain as that. Now, be it if you consider not only Europe, but even Canada, Canada is also facing that kind of insecurity based upon the transactional nature of international diplomacy, which for a first time a US president has shown after many, many decades altogether. We have to keep one thing in mind. When it comes to international relations, the world since Second World War has always thought of Europe and the region of North America as a single geopolitical region. This was influenced by Mackinder's theory of the two large powers or two regions having similarity, separated by a large water body that is the Atlantic Ocean. Now, all the various theories in international relation also when you go through it, starting with Mackinder. Now they talk about the fact that European population and the North American population, they have a similar origin, and they have similar interests, similar ideas, and they both participate and cooperate with each other in terms of the global strategic outlook. And that is how it has remained for a long period of time. Be it NATO or G7, these have been the driving force behind global policy making for a very long period of time. However, in the recent times, that is for the past few months itself, the regions or the groupings like G7, groupings like NATO, rather than becoming areas of cooperation and forums for cooperations, they have become forums for contestations, where you have the US president publicly expressing outrage over the lack of defense spending by the European nations or basically taking US for a ride. Now, that has created a larger divide between these nations, and Europe is now left fending for its own. Think about it for a moment. When you talk about Ukraine and the Russia Ukraine crisis, now Ukraine was asked to disarm itself based upon US's commitments. US had committed and Europe had committed that we will protect Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Once the Russian aggression did happen, after that, US, right now you see, is withdrawing its support from Ukraine. It is true that yesterday, or day before yesterday rather, you had the US president talking about sending Patriot missile systems into Ukraine. But then, along with that statement, Donald Trump included another very, very dangerous statement, so to say. Uh, Donald Trump said that we are going to provide Patriot missiles to Ukraine, provided they give us the money for it. For us, it is business as usual. For them, it is about defense. That is transactionalism at its level best. And that is why Europe seeks to rebalance its ties. So, transactional nature of ties. Now, US has also increasingly started diverting its attention towards the region of Indo-Pacific. deactivation of airfields in the region of Guam, and arming the region around Hawaii, that has indicated the US shift of attention towards the region of the Pacific, where it sees China as its major, or say, opponent, and the other major power that can challenge US rather than Russia, closing up with traditional adversaries and G7 and NATO being the forums of contestation. So this has basically driven the region of Europe into a particular corner. But thereafter, what are the arguments when we talk about Europe and India? Where does India come in? As Europe seeks to rebalance its ties with the world, why does and where does India figure in the picture? We have to understand that when we talk about major European powers, be it France, Germany, or for that matter, across the Atlantic, even Canada, they have been facing certain amount of criticism from their domestic audience as well. And that has led to policy recalibration. UK, if we take the example of UK for that matter, UK basically, post Brexit, was in a kind of a euphoric situation where they thought that post Brexit, UK alone can be a superpower on its own. It does not need international cooperation anymore. And UK will be self dependent, so to say. But then the reality has now dawned in after a slow growth in economy and the changing political landscape within UK itself, where the conservatives, the labor, all of them are finding it increasingly difficult to bring about any kind of reforms. So UK, in the face of this kind of conundrum and this kind of a dichotomy, whether to go alone or whether to seek partnership, has started looking at mainland Europe, that is the continental Europe. So UK is seeking to increase ties with France, with Germany, and other European nations in order to have a stronger foothold in the region. When we talk about Germany, now there have been increased discussions in Germany for the recalibration and the reinvigoration of what has been referred to as, or what was earlier, the Weimar Triangle. Now, what was the Weimar Triangle? Weimar Triangle basically included the countries of Poland, Germany, and France. And this was conceptualized around 1991, France. Now, this was a triangular cooperation which was sought in order to improve political dialogue, in order to improve defense cooperation and security cooperation in general. So Germany, which after Second World War had taken a firm stance not to arm itself, is going for constitutional changes in order to increase its defense spending. After all, in every other NATO meeting and in every other global forum, Donald Trump does lash out at countries like Germany and does ask them to increase their defense spending by almost 5% of the GDP, which is massive. For countries which have never done so, that would mean reallocation of funds, increased borrowings, and restarting an industry which has been dormant in these areas for a long period of time. When we talk about country like France, France basically is seeking to again provide a nuclear umbrella for the region of Europe. And for that, France needs international trade partners. And in that international trade, India figures prominently in that list. The Indo French trade has increased by more than 300% in the recent years, and deepening defense cooperation between France and India is a proof in that same spectrum. So, France and Germany increase in defense spending, strategic rebalancing in Europe, and UK post Brexit is seeking to increase ties with the continental Europe. And when we talk about Canada, Canada is seeking to pivot its policy attention to the east now. Rather than completely dependent on US, Canada is seeking to rebalance its ties again. Now, this is where, when we say strategic rebalancing, for a long period of time, strategic autonomy was considered to be a French fantasy, where being autonomous would actually mean isolation. But then today, strategic autonomy is something that all the countries of Europe are seeking. Now, in the world of power politics, where you have countries like US on one side, countries like China on the other side, they feel that they have the will, they have the so to say, wherewithal in order to carry out any kind of action in any third country, depending upon their own interest. That is where countries like India and Europe, or rather the regions like Europe and countries like India, they can figure greatly in geopolitical calculations, because both of these regions, we have a greater respect for international order, rule of law, democratic ideas, and also peaceful coexistence. That is why this strategic rebalancing has a role for India. Now, areas of cooperation. Why is it that we say that, or the article argues that India and Europe can have a better relation or more cooperation? What are the arguments? So, as we just discussed, there is a mutual respect for international order, mutual respect for international rules of law, mutual respect for democratic ideals, mutual respect for power to the people, and mutual respect for peaceful coexistence. That is not something that you find in rise or emergent superpowers like China, or regions or powers like Russia, which dominate the region of Eastern Europe. So that is where India comes in as a perfect partner. Now, other than that, the aim for multipolarity. Now, for a long period of time, the European region always cast an aspersion, or cast or took a look at India with a kind of a suspicious eye, that India was always seen as a country of non alignment, and that meant, again, India being shunned into the corner. But India has shifted its own stance from the case of non alignment to multi alignment. It is not that we won't be aligned to anyone. Rather, India's policy has changed to multi alignment. We will be aligned to multiple different poles. And that is where the international multipolarity comes into the picture. Where and what do we mean by multipolarity? Does that mean there will be many different monitors of the world? No. That simply means respecting each and every stakeholder in the global order. India, as a country representing around 17.5% of the global population, cannot be left behind in international policy decisions, be it climate change, be it food security, energy security, medicines, and so on. And so is the case with the European region as well. So that is why multipolarity is something that both these regions they are aiming for. And that is where the area of cooperation lies. Now, when it comes to trade, there again, after all, trade becomes one of the driving forces of modern day relations between the countries. Now, trade, in that also, India and Europe have two different levels of cooperation. The upper level, that is the India EU cooperation, India's cooperation overall with European Union, where, as you would be aware, that we are very close to finalizing a trade deal with European Union. So that is the upper level of cooperation, which will involve India's the goods trade, merchandise trade, as well as people to people exchanges in the entire European region. But at the subterranean level, it involves India's relation with UK, where we have just or recently finalized the trade deal, India's relation with France, India's increasing investment in the Nordic countries, India's increased participation in European dialogues. So that is the second level of trade relations which are happening. So that is why trade is also prospering. Slowly and steadily, it is ranging from simple goods trade to cooperation in defense tech to even cooperation in AI, which is the new frontier. Then, deep tech is being seen as an enabler in both these countries. For example, if you consider the existing superpower countries of the world, that is US. Now, US sees deep tech as a way or a means to enhance greater amount of capitalistic growth. That is where you have organizations and companies like Google, Microsoft, etc., raking in huge amount of revenue, and that is the concentration of wealth that US sees or looks at deep tech with a particular kind of a view. And when you take a look at China, China views deep tech as a kind of a power grab opportunity. That growth in deep tech will allow it to dominate the world order. Europe and India being the regions which sees deep tech as an enabler for better life and livelihood for the population, better job opportunities, better food security, energy security, and that is why deep tech cooperation can only happen in like minded regions and like minded countries. So, that is again an area of cooperation. However, not everything is absolutely picture perfect when it comes to Indo EU relations. There are certain thorns along the way, and there are certain challenges that we have to be mindful of. For example, Europe has decided to impose the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM. CBAM basically means that any of the products, let's suppose steel product, which is manufactured in India, now if it is exported to Europe, as soon as it enters the EU territory, there will be a tariff or a tax imposed, because Europe argues that look, we have different climatic conditions and the different, rather, the different parameters of uh, climatic governance, emission standards, and emission regulation. And India has got lower emission regulation, and India doesn't follow those kind of emission norms. So that is why the polluting industries in India should be punished. So it is a kind of a border tax, carbon border tax. And the imposition of CBAM will influence Indian exports such as Indian steel, right? Then other than that, even aluminium sector, fertilizers, cement, all of them will be impacted. So as a consequence, this is seen by countries like India as carbon protectionism that Europe is engaging in. Mind you, Europe was one of the key proponents of liberalization and globalization of the world economy. Now, when Europe resorts to a kind of a protectionism that if anything is imported from India, we will impose a tariff, that is again very, or an opposing point of view from the aspect of a liberalized global order. So, that is a challenging area, or that is a challenge that both these regions have to overcome. Other than that, public perception. Now, public perception is oftentimes a driver of international relations. Oftentimes. Now, India is a land of huge diversity, from north to south, from east to west. Everywhere, you have a diverse culture, diverse tradition, but at the same time, democratic ideals are basically imbibed in the very inherent living of the society. But whenever any such untoward incident happens, let's suppose where a person is persecuted, or wherever, let's suppose, there is a kind of a mob violence, then Europe builds a perception that democratic ideals in India are in danger and democracy in India is in danger. And that is when Europe looks at India with a very suspicious eye. Now, that again provides or makes India and Europe come at the brink of opposition with each other. So, public perception in Europe and Europe overall as a region has to understand that democracy in their country is very differently followed as compared to our country. In our country, the amount of diversity that we have, that in itself can encompass the entire continent of Europe. Where the countries are divided on linguistic basis, we have so many states on linguistic basis. So there are various different instances where linguistic divide, religious divide, ethnic divide, they come to the fore. And immediately Europe comes to a conclusion that India is undemocratic, India is not free anymore, and this has been going on for decades. Since 50s, 60s, 70s, any of the European policy paper that you pick up, they always talk about that how India is on the verge of collapse. Now, Indian policymakers and the government in India has never taken a kind look at these kind of public perceptions developing in Europe. And that has been an obstacle in the deepening of Indo ties. But then, in most recent phenomena, you have the perception about terrorism. Now, when a terrorist act did happen in India recently, Europe talked about it in a very mild manner and considered and even termed that attack as an attack by certain gunmen or at max militias. The word terrorism is something which they refrain from using. And this goes in tune with a long standing European perception that in countries like India, when terrorist acts happen, it is largely a law and order problem. It is not a long time back when you had an attack on the legislative assembly in Srinagar. Now that was termed by many of the press in Europe as an attack on government building. Now, legislative assembly, if it is akin to a simple government building, that defeats the entire purpose of understanding what terrorism is. So that is where Europe's perception about terrorism and Europe's inhibition of singling out the source of origin of terror, that is Pakistan, that has raised suspicious eyes in India again. And that again damages the public perception. Public perception, if it is better, the ties automatically improve. But if the public perceptions are not good, regardless of how many overtures you do, the ties cannot improve. Take a look at India and Russia. The trade between India and Russia has been on a decline. The defense partnership between India and Russia has been on a decline. On many international forums, India and Russia don't get together and get along anymore. But the public perception in these countries is very good for each other. Indian population in general looks at Russia as a traditional ally, and the Russian population in general also looks at India as a kind of an ally. So, regardless of the realities in terms of economic parameter, the ties are at a better level. So, that is why public perception becomes a very important tool in shaping and hammering international diplomacy. That is a challenge that both these regions have to overcome. However, there have been certain green shoots which indicate that the alliance has been progressing really well. For example, the India EU trade deal is being close to being finalized. Also, the people's movement, people to people exchange, is an important part of mending relationships and building relationships. India being one of the suppliers of the skilled manpower that we have, that can significantly aid in Europe's shortage of manpower when it comes to software sector and in other industries as well. Now think about it. The area of cooperation is so huge where Europe has got some amount of expertise when it comes to semiconductor, hardware manufacturing, and so on. The industrial ecosystem is very well built up. India, on the other hand, has an expertise on software. So hardware system and software system, both of them can come together in order to lead the way for the future development of the human population in general. And that will be for the betterment of not only the large population involved, but for the world order as well. Now, there have been dialogues and summit. For example, even the Munich Security Conference, which would be held in general, associated with American partners and European nations. Now, there also, India has been getting regular invite. And India's own think tank dialogue, that is the Rise in a Dialogue. Now, this year, Rise in a Dialogue was held in Marseille. Now, that in itself indicated the internationalization of India's think tank policy and deepening ties with the region of Europe. So, there are certain shoots which indicate that yes, the alliance is progressing well. For example, even the EU head had the visit to India earlier this year. And similarly, there has been multiple voices from the Chamber of EU talking about the deepening trade relations. So, while these green shoots do prevail, we do have to overcome the challenges which exist in order to ensure that the rebalancing of global ties puts India as well as EU in a better place to lead the world order. So, that is the crux of this article. So, in summarization, what have we discussed? The need for rebalancing of ties. Why is it that Europe is seeking to rebalance the ties? Where does India come in? And what are the areas of cooperation between India and EU, ranging from deep tech to multipolarity to people exchange, trade, etc. What are the challenges which are in existence in order to deepen the ties between India and EU? And what are certain green shoots which have begun to show and which are a larger indicator of the deepening ties? So here, a question can definitely be expected, and that is a subjective type question to discuss the relevance of Indo-European ties in the changing world order. So here, basically, it is a 15 marker question where you have to write a detailed answer. Now, how do you write the answer for Rise in a Dialogue is basically a think tank based dialogue organized by ORF, the Observer Research Foundation in India. And Rise in a Dialogue basically gets the various different ministers and spokesperson for various different governments together, and they talk about emerging international order and the emerging geopolitical challenges. So that is the Rise in a Dialogue, which has been held successfully for a few years now, where you have a kind of congregation of global heads of state and also increasingly the prominent voices across the globe when it comes to the geopolitical aspect of the world. Now, the relevance of India European ties in the changing world order. So, how do you introduce the answer? What do you write in the intro? Intro can be provided in two aspects here. Two different approaches can be used. One can be if you focus on this key changing world order. The world as we speak is in a state of flux with kinetic point of conflicts being very prominently found in various different regions of the planet, from Middle East to the region of Russia and at the doorsteps of Europe, Africa, and so on. That needs the rebalancing of ties across the globe. That can be one way to introduce the answer. The second way can be the relevance of Indo European ties. So, Indo European ties basically are about the deepening international cooperation. India and the region of Europe are very, very important in global economic order and also forwarding the uh, climate justice, or when it comes to the way of life or the standard of living, achievement of SDGs, etc. So, in either of the way, you can introduce. After that, in the body. Now, if let's suppose you have started the answer by the introduction of changing world order, that is where in the body you start to talk about, or you need to talk about the reasons for rebalancing. Okay, that is the transactional nature of West, the kind of challenge to the old traditional ties which are in existence, and so on. And then after that, areas of cooperation, areas of cooperation. Now, this is a 15 marker question. So, in this, do follow the 70 to 30 rule. That is what we talked about earlier. That 70% of your answer has to address what has been directly asked in the question. 30% you can address what is implicitly associated with the topic but not directly asked. So, here the 30% can be used to talk about that even though the ties are progressing at various levels as indicated by certain aspects, talk about the challenges, prevailing challenges. Right? What are the prevailing challenges? You do mention them in the point subparagraph manner. Eventually, that will lead you to the conclusion. Conclusion has to gain a kind of a way forward in this. So, what do you write in way forward? India and Europe represent the democratic ideals very important for maintaining the world order, and also the respect of international rule of law, which is very important for the peaceful coexistence of the nations. The increasing depth of ties between these regions are not only important for the citizens of these places associated, but eventually the cooperation can herald a better era for the global order. So, like that, you can end the entire answer. Okay. Now, moving on to the second article, very much associated with the first article itself, and that is the article is too close for comfort. Now, this is about the relations between Canada and US. Now, the Trump administration, when they came to power, they blatantly talked about Canada being one of the 51st state of the US. If you remember and recall the initial months and initial weeks of the Trump administration, they talked about incorporating or rather getting Greenland into the fold of US, getting Canada into the fold of US. It appeared like a 17th century imperialistic plan. But then US has been particularly harsh to Canada in recent times in terms of the statements that are made by the public policymakers, in terms of even the tax and the tariffs which are being imposed. So Canada is also not feeling very comfortable with the ties with its traditional ally that has been. Now, US and particularly Donald Trump has been irked by the kind of trade deficit that it has with Canada. US and Canada, they have a very prosperous trade. But then the trade deficit is close to around $63 billion in the favor of Canada, right? $63 billion in favor of Canada. So Canada is, or US is facing a kind of a trade deficit. Now, US has been alleging various different US for a long period of time, and still even today does allege that fentanyl, one of the opioids which enters the US market, US has been alleging that the kind of addiction which happens to fentanyl and the kind of issues that the society faces due to fentanyl addiction, that is being fueled by Canada. Whereas various different researchers have indicated that only around 0.1% of the fentanyl which enters into US is through its northern borders. The rest of the fentanyl does enter from the ports and even from the southern borders. But nonetheless, this has been used as a kind of a parameter to target Canada by the US policymakers. Now, Canada recently had imposed a digital service tax, DST, right? DST of around 3% on the digital services. Now, various different countries impose this digital services tax for the IT companies in general, to put it in a very simple or a mild manner, that basically the IT companies who are involved in digital services, now when they basically operate in a cross-border manner, there is a tax which is sometimes imposed by nations. Now, Canada imposed 3% of DST. Now, think about it and listen to this carefully. When Canada did impose this 3% DST, that was supposed to give Canada a revenue of how much? $5 billion. That's it. In international trade, and that too in between countries like US and Canada, $5 billion amounts to nothing. But this $5 billion is also not something which Canada would gain in 1 year. Spread across 5 years. Spread across 5 years from 2022. Right. So it was almost $1 billion worth of tariff. Right. Now, Donald Trump, being the person that he is, being the individual that he is, Donald Trump did not take it lightly. Donald Trump declared it as a war on American firms and very quickly basically threatened Canada with debilitating tariffs that would be imposed. Now, over a period of time, Canada rescinded this DST. That is, it withdrew this DST, that we will not impose this tax. So Donald Trump again basically softened his stance and said that, okay, we will also not impose that much amount of tariff on Canada. However, recently again, Donald Trump shot a letter to Canada talking about imposition of tariff in the tune of close to around 35% tax. Now, that 35% tax imposition would be very, very damaging to the world or to the Canadian businesses and the Canadian trade in general. Now, as a consequence, Canada has started looking at alternatives in order to rebalance its ties. A couple of days ago, you had the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, meeting the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and both of them talked about deepening of the ties. In fact, Carney said and posted it on X or Twitter as well, that in the era of uncertainty, the world looks at Canada for reassurance. So, in a way, Canada is signaling that look, They are okay with rebalancing the ties, and Canada is pivoting to the. It is in this outreach that Canada has also tried to reach out to countries like India. In the G7 summit, which was held in Canada recently, invite was rolled out to India. And recent actions by the Canadian authorities have indicated that they have started to look at the Khalistani terrorists with a different eye. And they have agreed to start taking some actions against the Khalistani terrorists based in Canada. So that is where Canada is rebalancing its policy, because economic sanctions can only push a country to such an extent before the country starts to basically retaliate. And the article argues that here lies a lesson that was earlier showed to us between India and Nepal. India and Nepal. For those of us who are not aware about what happened between India and Nepal in the recent times, so basically it was around 2016, 2017. So around 2016, 2017, when Nepal was adopting its new constitution, at that point of time, the framing of the new constitution actually that appeared to endanger the interests of the local Madhesi population. The Madhesi population, which has got closer ties to the Indian population in the northern Bihar, northern Uttar Pradesh, and so on. So the Madhesis, who have traditional ties with India, now they were aggrieved with the adoption of new constitution with Nepal. So as a consequence, India decided to punish Nepal. And what did India do? India basically provided, or rather, did a kind of an economic blockade. Now, that blockade meant, because Nepal was completely dependent on ports like Kolkata and trade routes through India for all its domestic supplies and domestic requirements. So, India knew this. So, India basically imposed an economic blockade with Nepal. Why? India said that do change your newer constitution and do include the interests for the Madhesi population. Whereas Nepal saw it as an interference in its own internal affairs. As a consequence of this economic blockade, Nepal faced fuel shortage. Nepal faced medicine shortage. Nepal faced food shortage. The GDP growth of Nepal plummeted to around 0.2% from an earlier, healthier 3.3%. As a consequence, what did Nepal do? In 2017, because Nepal was pushed to a corner by India, what did Nepal do? Nepal joined the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And basically, Nepal started accepting large amount of funds from China for infrastructure development and deepening of infrastructure from the region of Tibet into Nepal. Now, that is a lesson to be learned, that India basically decided to push Nepal into a corner based on economic aspects, and that led to the rebalancing of ties in the region. It was immediately after this when you had Nepal creating a large outcry over the construction of road in the Lipu Lake Pass by India, and that was done by the Border Road Organization. Now, Nepal contested that Lipu Lake Pass actually belongs to Nepalese territory itself, whereas Lipu Lake is actually an accepted tri-junction between India, Nepal, and China. But then, aided and triggered by these events, Nepal did change its stance. So the article argues that economic forces actually can threaten the global geopolitical alliances and can lead to rebalancing. So US can learn from India's experience and can cooperate with Canada. Otherwise, Canada is going to shift its alliances with other countries, be it Europe or be it even China. Now, after that, we come to the third article. That is women, STEM careers, and a more receptive industry. Now, what is STEM, by the way? STEM here refers to science, tech, engineering, and mathematics. That is associated with STEM. Now, what is the article all about? The article talks about the fact that when it comes to the women labor force participation not only in general across the country is less than desirable, but when it comes to STEM courses, that is science, researchers, engineering, jobs, right, mathematical researchers, there the female participation in a country like India is absolutely less. That does impact us economically as well as socially. Now, the labor force survey has indicated that the female labor force participation in India has increased since the COVID times. But the increase is observed in rural India rather than being observed in the urban centers of the country. Now, why is it that female labor force participation is less? Is it because women are not capable enough? No. It is simply because of the social hindrances and the social roadblocks, the mental roadblocks which have been provided along the way. There has been a long standing perception that mechanical work is suited for men. And that has morphed in the digital era to say that even coding is something which is associated with the male workforce. Women are not good enough for coding. Now, this has created certain kind of roadblocks even in the industries. And that is where, while the government policy is important to improve the women labor force participation, at the same time, industry needs to take a lead in order to improve the labor force participation as well. Now, here, let us take a look at some of the data offered, and we will also take a look at one of the case studies which has been mentioned in the article, which can be used by you while you are writing answers or while you are even writing an essay paper. So, starting first of all, the labor force participation. Now, this labor force participation survey gives you an idea about the total unemployed population and so on. Now, PLFS 23-24, as per that, the female labor force participation in India is close to around 41.7%. Now, please keep that in mind. 41.7% is still an improvement as compared to, let's suppose, 2022-23, when it was an abysmal 30%. So, there is an improvement. But at the same time, you also have to understand that in the regions like China, that labor force participation is around 60% and higher. So there is a lot to be achieved and lot to be desired even now. But then, if you take a look at this labor force participation, skewed in the rural countryside, you will find that the labor force participation is around 47.6%, whereas in the urban area, it is an abysmal 25%. So, in urban areas, only 25% of the women they are participating in the workforce. What about the rest 75%? So the rest 75% they don't go into or they don't participate in the labor force due to certain reasons. What are the reasons? And take a look at your own surrounding and you will come across the conclusion. First of all, the workforces they are often seemed or deemed to be unsafe for women. So safety is one of the paramount areas. Okay. So when we talk about safety, it is one of the paramount reasons. Other than that, you also have a hostile environment in terms of how do you access the workplace? How do you travel to the work? If let's suppose it takes you 2 to 2.5 hours in order to reach your workplace, obviously that is not very desirable. And that is where job is looked at a kind of a compulsion. So, in urban areas, particularly post COVID, there have been multiple research papers which have indicated that many of the urban women they have left their jobs because the family feels that they are economically comfortable. The woman does not need to go out to earn money. So, when you take a look at work only from the paradigm or the parameter of earning money, that is where the women they are not allowed to. So, that is where you have the societal foundation. Then hostile workplace workplace then also the perceptions that are built. that if you are going for work, if a girl or if a woman is going for work, then there must be certain compulsions behind that. So, owing to these particular kind of societal foundations, that is why women take a back seat and they don't go for work. Whereas in rural area, it is seen as more of a compulsion. That is why they have a participative labor. But in urban area, that is not. Now, when we talk about STEM sector, now the STEM sector even worse. For example, only 31%, as per a research by UNESCO, only 31% of researchers globally are women. It is primarily male dominated. When we talk about India and observe the parameters of India carefully, and you will understand the issue. The parameter of India indicates 43% of the STEM graduates are women. That is, when they are studying, they do pursue the disciplines of science, engineering, mathematics, and so 43%. It is a healthy proportion, one of the highest in the major economies. But what happens after they graduate? Look at that. Only 27% of the STEM workforce is women. So basically, that means that everybody who graduates, right, as all the women who graduate from the STEM courses, they don't pursue a job in STEM. Now, that is a debilitating factor. That is something which is pulling the population back. And the labor force participation is a must. That leads to eventually we have to understand that a society where the women they are free to work and they are willing to work, the society allows them and makes the environment conducive for the women to work, that society is always going to be healthier in the sense that women will have a greater economic autonomy. And economic autonomy leads to a kind of even right to property eventually, implicitly. And that will lead to the women empowerment. So, women empowerment, rather than imposing certain government policies and only dependent on government policies, that is never going to achieve women empowerment. We have had multiple government policies since decades now aiming for achieving women empowerment. Have we achieved the true sense of women empowerment? The answer is no. The reason behind that is simple. They don't have the economic freedom. When they have the economic freedom and when they have that trust and faith in themselves that, okay, the next paycheck is coming and I can take my own decisions, that truly empowers. And that has been indicated by various different focus groups in self-help groups in the rural countryside as well, where it has been found that women participating in self-help groups, particularly in the region like Madhya Pradesh, in areas like Bihar, they indicate a much greater autonomy as compared to the women who are completely dependent on the household for their own expenditure. So that is why the participation is a must. The role of women in the work, even if you consider only for economic parameter, there also, according to McKinsey Global Study and Analytics, which has come out with a report, it talks about the fact that if India would have managed the addition of 68 million women in its workforce by 2025, our economy could have benefited by almost $700 billion. Think about it. We think about ways to increase our GDP to achieve $5 trillion economy, $10 trillion economy, and so on. A simple key in that is make the workforce suitable for women, make the transportation suitable for women, and automatically the GDP improves. The World Bank basically suggests that if you achieve 50% female labor force participation, the GDP automatically increases by 1%. We also have to understand that female labor force participation is not only associated with economic paradigm, that also improves the social indicator. Because when a woman is working, now that means that even in the family, the awareness about nutrition, nourishment, that is always better. So the instances that we have of malnourished children and the lack of proper nutrition, all of that can be taken into surveillance, provided the women participate. Now, there has been certain government initiatives, multiple government initiatives that the article talks about. Now, the government has started to focus on upskilling and reskilling of the women population, increased focus on revamping the ITIs, right? Providing increased stress on vocational training. All of these are steps in the right direction. Now, vocational training, particularly in, let's suppose, the tech sector, is very much important. Now, the again, the problem is the workplace. Now, gender budget allocation overall, if you take a look at the budgetary allocation, there also it has indicated a marked increase from 6.8% in 2024-25. It has increased to almost 8.8% in 25-26. And the union budget does talk about and did offer loans to women entrepreneurs at a subsidized rate, funded national skill training institutes, and supported tech driven skilling initiatives. So the government initiatives are there, but they will all be futile unless and until we change the societal mindset. And how do you change the societal mindset? Let's suppose at the time when someone goes to school, from that time itself, if, let's suppose, in the classroom you start showing them about the female role model in industries, the female role models that we talk about generally are associated either in the pre-independence time or as the head of state and so on, but in industry as researchers. Now, that female role model as researchers, as astronauts, that can pave way in the shaping of the dream. You have to keep one thing in mind. As a society, we have been suffering from the aspect of patriarchy for centuries now. Appending all of that requires grassroots reform. And that grassroots reform can be fulfilled only if we start changing from the bottoms up. Now, the role of industry here comes to the front. When we talk about industry, it is the duty of the industry to make the workforce much more conducive for and breaking the social barriers and perceptions. As I told you, mechanical job for men, coding for men, that cannot be the modern parameters and the modern crucibles anymore. Offering structured mentoring, right, in terms of the career development. Because in many of the cases, in many of the families, the person or the female who is going to the workplace, she might be very well the first individual who is trying that. They might not have any clue about how the career progression takes place. So they need that structured mentoring programs, and the industries have to offer them to increase the role of women in the top governance. Now, creating education to career pathways, partnering with institutions to accommodate life transitions like maternity, caregiving, etc. Because even today, the reality of the industry that operates is that maternity or motherhood is often times seen as a kind of a step back for women. That is why oftentimes the women, they are forced to choose between motherhood, family life, and professional life. Both of them can coexist. And European countries and the North American countries have indicated the coexistence of both of them. So that is something which the industry has to focus on. Now, a case study has started yielding positive results, particularly in the region of Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat, where you have the UN Women's Peace STEM program that is basically supported by the Foundation. Now, what it aims to do, engaging families and community leaders in order to increase the awareness about the role of women, then workplace safety sessions, then introducing female role models in classroom. So this kind of a model can be taken across the country and in various different areas up to the grassroots level to indicate their importance and their role. Because we have to understand a modern society cannot exist without an active role of half of its population. We can live in ignorance, but we cannot live in denial. So that is basically where the role of women becomes paramount. Now, practice question. Women in STEM workforce is not a desired thinking, but a necessity. discuss in the Indian context. So here, the 10 mark question it is. So how do you write the intro? So intro here can use certain data pointer that while 43% of the graduates from STEM courses in India are comprising of women, but only 27% enter into the workforce, indicating a lack of labor force participation and so on. Or the UNESCO research indicates that only 31% of the researchers are actually women. So that angle can also be taken. So, nonetheless, that is what you write. So, data centric intro. Why do you provide data centric intro in this? Because this question is talking about a problem. Now, with the intro, you provide a flow and tell the evaluator that I know about the problem. I'm aware about the problem. And then, after that, in the body, talk about, first of all, the issue. Why? Why you have reduced participation. Okay. So that is where you talk about social hindrances, popular perceptions, unsafe workplace, the transition, so economic security, etc. Then, after that, you talk about the way ahead. What can be done? So, in what can be done? Government enabling by the government, so government policy, very important to basically talk about industry's role. Okay. Then mention about the overall role in economy. Okay. Importance of labor force participation. What is the importance? Economic, social, all of this has to be mentioned. Eventually, in the conclusion, you talk about that what we have already mentioned, that modern society cannot be thought about without the active participation of women, and the role of women is much greater than simply being a caregiver or a kind of a mother, but as a driver of the family eventually. So, like that, you can conclude and talk about the importance of having greater labor force participation. Okay? Now, um, can outdated knowledge and training provided by educational institutes be a reason for low recruitment? That is something that we discussed yesterday for the low employability. But please understand, it cannot be the case that any educational institution, Chirag, think about it. Can it be the case that an educational institution is providing updated knowledge to men and a kind of predated information to women? No. So, if the same set of information is provided to men and women, why is it that women are not able to have equal participation? So, there are societal hindrances. Okay. Now, after that, any other doubts? Dr. Tharoor's article doesn't address the trust issues EU have with India being the second biggest. So, yes, it doesn't talk about that particular aspect about EU's aspersions with India. But as of now, EU is more concerned with the aspect of US withdrawing its support from EU rather than India getting some amount of Russian oil. EU has come to terms with the fact that India can be a vital channel to initiate dialogue with Russia. Okay. Now, after that, the article that we have talked about multiple times, so we are not going to discuss that in much greater detail. Now, this has been written by the ambassador of the state of Palestine to India. That is the two-state reality we see today. Now, this article basically talks about the fact that starting with the late 1940s, when the UN resolution did talk about a two-state solution in the region of Palestine, the world has basically forgotten that UN resolution in it. This is aided, and this entire narrative that has been brought by the article, that is influenced by some of the US policymakers who have blatantly made the statement that they don't consider any particular individual as Palestinians. That is the region of Israel, and Palestinians are basically occupying the region of Israel. So that is what the article argues, that look, The world has got a very short memory. From the UN agreements and the UN resolution earlier to the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, the Palestinian authorities and the Palestinian population, they have been accommodating in terms of Israeli wishes. But over a period of time, Israel's occupation in the region has increased to such an extent that now the Palestinians are on the fringes and they are on the verge of facing a complete genocide, which they are already facing in terms of the Israeli aggression. Now, here, basically, when we talk about the Oslo Accords or when we talk about the UN resolution, now all of them they talk about the two-state solution. The US policymakers in the case of the present ongoing Mideast conflict. Now, you can argue that the Trump administration in general is a bit ignorant about the global geopolitical order, right? With the Trump administration and rather Donald Trump himself talking about the Kashmir dispute existing for around 1500 years, isn't it? So they are absolutely ignorant about the global order and the global geopolitics. So that is where the Trump administration has recently made a statement that we can come at a solution that is a two-state solution, and that can end the war in the region of Israel. Now, the article argues that this two-state solution is not a brainchild of the Trump administration. In fact, if the Trump administration were to revisit history, they would find the evidence of the solution of two-state solution being talked about across the globe. For that matter, even India's policy towards Israel has always talked about the existence of the two-state solution. Now, the two-state solution was once the central piece to the peace talks between Israel and Palestine. The UN's 1947 partition plan proposed two states, one for Jews and one for the Palestinians. But over a period of time, you would see that how the map of the region has changed. Now, this is a map of 1946, which basically consisted of certain Jewish settlements in what the article argues is the historic Palestinian state. Now, yes, there is a conflict that whether this is a historical Israeli state or whether this is a historical Palestinian state, but that is not an argument we will enter into. Nonetheless, in the pre 1947 era, this was referred to as the Palestinian region. Now, the UN plan as per 1947 sought to basically divide the region. Two-state solution looked and appeared to be something like this. But over a period of time, observe what has happened. The Palestinians are now restricted to certain. The Oslo Accords talked about basically dividing the landmass with 78%, right? 78% being controlled by the Israelis and 22% being controlled by the Palestinians. The article argues that this in itself was a major concession made by the Palestinians and the Palestinian authorities, where they considered themselves to be restricted only to 22% of the land. But over a period of time, what has happened is that not only has Israel cemented its control over the 78%, it has started gaining ground in the remaining 20%. In many of the regions of these 22%, which was originally associated with the Palestinians as per the Oslo Accords, now Israeli militias and so called autonomous groups, they have started occupying these territories. Now they are funded by Tel Aviv and they have their own independent policy measure, all to discredit the Palestinians. And that is where the article basically raises a question at the international community. That international community has got a choice to make whether to ignore the Israeli actions or to take a decisive action. Now, ever since the Russian war in Ukraine started, there have been more than 16,000 sanctions in various different forms and order imposed on Russia. But when we talk about Israel, the world has basically turned a blind eye. It is true that Israel's action was initiated by the October 7 event, which endangered the very existence of the state. But then what that is morphing in today is actually basically seeming more and more like a genocidal action. So that is why the international community can either disregard the Palestinian population completely because they don't have the power, they don't have the wherewithal, or they can actually talk about what Israel is doing in Gaza. And this is where even the domestic population of Israel has increasingly started asking questions from the Netanyahu government about its future plan of action in the region of the Gaza Strip. Because eventually, you also have to understand and look at the larger pattern. Now, when you had Benjamin Netanyahu and basically his government experiencing a declining popularity, now the October 7 attack by Hamas in Israel was seen as a galvanizing factor, and Israel retaliated with a massive force. It is true that Israel, in terms of its international community, has got unwavering support of US. So that is where it keeps on getting the arms and the ammunitions continuously. Now, when the Israeli retaliation happened in Palestine, in the region of Gaza, that is when the popularity of the Netanyahu government started to increase. But after again, more than a year later, that popularity again started to decline. And that is when questions were being asked again on Bibi's government. And what did Netanyahu did after that? He attacked Iran. So this again is basically internationalization of political ambition by the region of Israel. That is why the international community in one voice has to condemn and has to bring an end to the actions which are happening in the region of Gaza. Various true stocks have come to a standstill. Countries like France, they are openly calling Israeli action as genocide. And that is where the European nations, the US in particular, has to make a stance, right? Now, after that, coming to certain articles relevant for your prelims, starting with inflation continues to cool as food prices, crude rates, they dip. Now, this indicates that declining inflation rate when it comes to CPI and when it comes to WPI. Now, when you talk about CPI, Consumer Price Index, now Consumer Price Index has cooled down to 2.1%. Now, do you need to learn the percentile here? Absolutely not. You just need to observe the trend. Why has CPI reduced? Now, CPI is at its lowest amongst multiple months now, owing to a continued reduction in the food or the food inflation. The food inflation has been reduced. Why? The reason being agricultural productivity and better supply chain logistics. Owing to that, the food prices have been coming down. So that basically makes it easier for the consumer in general. On top of that, even the fuel prices, the crude oil price, despite the Iran Israel conflict, despite the Russia Ukraine conflict, the crude oil prices have also come down. They have cooled down. So, as a consequence, the price involved in transportation of goods, commodities, etc., from one region to another, that has basically come down. So, your logistic cost has come down, meaning overall price parameter will come. So, this is good for the larger population. This can drive the demand. But then, even the WPI, the wholesale price index has also declined and it has entered into a negative territory. That means there is a reduction in prices. In the case of CPI, the inflation rate has come down. Listen to this carefully. In the case of CPI, inflation rate has come down, whereas in WPI, there has been a contraction. Now, that is again aided by these, but then basically points a finger at a larger issue. When the wholesale prices continue to dip month after month, is that desirable in an economy? The answer is no. When the WPI keeps on coming down in the negative territory month after month, that means the fall in demand. There is a fall in demand in the economy. Now, whenever there is a fall in demand, that means, let's suppose the industries which are operating, now they won't be operating at their full capacity, isn't it? That means the number of employment or the jobs that they could generate, so many jobs are not created. So, joblessness means what? You have so many people without income, without salary. They won't be going to the market to buy, let's suppose, goods or consumer items. So again, that is a vicious cycle of poverty which is kick-started. So that is why once the CPI and WPI both are in these territory, that basically, or in most of the cases, leads to the softening of the policy. In these conditions, what does the central bank do in most of the cases? Whether RBI will follow this or not is a matter for different discussion altogether. But what do most of the central banks do in this? They want to increase the demand in the economy. And how do you increase the demand in the economy? By increasing the money supply in the economy. And how do you increase the money supply in the economy? By lowering the rates, lowering of rate, right? Interest rate. So if this trend continues, then we can expect that in the next monetary policy cycle, RBI can be expected further lower the rates by at least around 50 basis point in order to boost the demand and growth economy. Okay, because please understand that this is coming at the backdrop of another important indicator that we had covered, that is a lowering of the index of industrial production, the IIP. That growth rate had declined. So that means the production level is down, and there also electricity was one of the bad performers, which means MSMEs are not consuming electricity at the same, right? So in order to improve the overall production, that is why there can be a lowering of interest rates going ahead into the future. Now, then another article. Famous for its rhinos, Kaziranga records high diversity of grassland birds in. Now, one of its kind survey was carried out for the grassland birds. When we talk about Kaziranga, Kaziranga is a large protected area situated in the region of Assam Brahmaputra floodplains. Now, it is known for its diversity. While the major animals like, let's suppose, the rhinos, one-horned rhinos, tiger population, elephant population, they grab all the headlines. But a key indicator of the health of the grassland is the aviary population, that is the bird population to be found in the region. Now, in the region of Kaziranga, you have variety of different bird population to be found. Now, the survey which has been done has indicated an increase or uptick in population in certain cases of the birds. For example, Fin's weaver being one of those. Now, here, two of the birds which are mentioned are relevant for your examination. Now, one of them is basically the Bengal florican, or rather the lesser florican. So, when we talk about the Bengal florican, it is critically endangered. Okay. Now, they do consume insects, flies, etc. Geographical range from the Tarai belt of India all the way extending up till the region of Brahmaputra plains, right? But other than India, also to be found in the region of Bhutan, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Now, they basically are reliant on the grassland population in general, right? Now, the threats hunting, grazing by livestock, and destruction of habitats due to burning, due to wildfires, and even due to climate change. So, this is one of the species of bustard that you have in India. By the way, these species are important for your prelims, and that is why do take a look at the video of species in news. Now, that will be released tomorrow on the same channel in the evening. So, do take a look into that particular edition of Species in News for the month of June. If we have not already taken a look at the Species in News for the month of May, do ensure that before tomorrow you do revise the species which have remained in news for the month of May. A periodic revision will ensure that your prelims preparation is sorted much before the date. Now, another species which has been mentioned in this is the Finn's weaver. Now, Finn's weaver is referred to as endangered. Now, Finn's weaver is known for building elaborate nest on top of the trees. It does accumulate various different type of items and makes a very elaborate nest. Now it is found primarily again in the Tarai grasslands and some populations of endangered as listed by IUCN and even BirdLife International. So that is fins. So these two particular species is what you have to keep in mind. Now, scientists find pheromone that causes locusts to swarm and a way to block it. So basically, locusts, which are very similar to that in morphological terms or in appearance to that of a grasshopper. The locusts, they are known to form large swarms. These locust swarms, last time they hit the subcontinent in 2019-2020, where the locust swarm basically started from the region of Africa. And that is where they crossed into Asia and they entered into the Indo Pakistan region as well. So that is basically the locust attack. Now, locust attack, when it happens, you have millions of population of these locusts who move from one green area to another. They devour on the fresh grasses, and in cases of farmlands, they will completely consume the crops within a matter of hours. The locusts can consume a mass equal to their own body weight within a span of few hours. And the locust swarm can consist of millions and millions of locust population. So you can think that they can completely create a barren land out of a green area. It is the smell of the fresh grass and the fresh crop which does attract them from one region to another, leading to loss of income, food insecurity, and so on. For a long period of time, this locust attack has been treated with the help of insecticide spray, sound alarms, and so on. But then their efficacy has been limited. Now, recent study which has been carried out in the Institute of Zoology at Chinese Academy of Sciences, Beijing, now that has indicated that locusts, they exhibit certain behavior. So when they are young, and understand this, when the locusts are young, they are solitary in terms of their nature, in terms of their behavior. Means they are basically exist in individual form, right? When they grow up, that is when they indicate or exhibit what is referred to as gregariousness. Gregariousness. That means coming together in large groups to perform an individual cooperation, right? So large groups performing cooperation, groups cooperate. Because please understand, how is this different from other things that you see? In any particular ecosystem, when you have multiple number of a same species, there exists competition rather than cooperation. Survival of the fittest is at play whenever large number of population exists. But in the case of locusts and certain other species population as well, after the solitary behavior, they start exhibiting gregariousness where cooperation becomes. Now, what do they do? The research has indicated that after consuming that fresh grass or after consuming that crop, they do emit the pheromones. Now, these pheromones act as a signal, and that brings the other locust species towards the existing one. And that is how the swarm is. And that swarm jumps from one area or one region of green, other areas of green, and they keep on consuming. So that is why certain particular kind of chemicals are and molecules are talked about, some in the category of phenols and so on, which can inhibit the spread and secretion of these. Because if these pheromones and that secretion can be stopped, then that large swarm formation of the attack can also. Okay, so this is about the locust swarm. So why does it form? Initially solitary behavior, then they indicate what? Gregariousness, that is cooperation. They move with the smell of fresh grass or the green growth that attracts them. So once they consume that, that is when they segregate pheromones which attract the other population. Okay, Now, the last article, tides turn for Machilipatnam as ancient port set for revival. Now, Machilipatnam is a very ancient port across the eastern coast of India. Now, various different text evidences, etc., indicate that this had been an ancient port of call at the mouth of River Krishna. River Krishna. That is vital for your prelims. And this was in use. Now, it was earlier you referred to as Masula, right? In first century AD. First century. After that, the records for this area they range from 6th to 8th century AD. But and eventually again around the 18th century. But for a long period of time, for the past 200 years, this has been now way back in 2007. The government had decided to redevelop the region. And that is where it was the project was initially given to Metas. Metas was a company or an organization of the controversial Satyam group, right? So that is why that particular process of construction of the port in the region could not be complete and it experienced setbacks. In 2020, a recalibrated and a reinvigorated approach for development was taken, where a special purpose vehicle was formed for the development, for the funding and the development of the uh, the Machilipatnam port. And this is where it was given to a renowned EPC builder, that is the Mega Constructions. And now the construction is nearing its end, and the port is expected to be operational by 2026. Now, where is this port situated? That becomes important as places in. So it is situated here. That is where you will find the Machilipatnam port situated, which is at the mouth of River Krishna. So that brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I hope the discussion has been helpful and has added content to your existing knowledge. If you have liked the discussion, put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like and the share button and do subscribe if you have not already subscribed to the channel. After this, I do suggest to you to do visit our Telegram channel and take a look at the multiple choice questions and analyze your understanding skills of these articles in discussion. We meet again tomorrow. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.